My brother said. You'll never be rich like me. So I did this at his engagement party. My name is Jada Pinkett. I'm 34 years old. And I grew up in Atlanta, Georgia, with a brother who made sure I never forgot I was second place. Malik was always the golden child, the chosen one, the blueprint of success my parents used to measure everything. From the time he was 12, winning debate trophies and scoring advanced placement classes, to his college years at Wharton, where the whole neighborhood received party invitations just to celebrate his internships. Malik was the family's pride. Meanwhile, I was the girl who filled sketchbooks, who painted on her bedroom wall, and who once said she wanted to design stories people could feel without reading a single word. My parents smiled politely and told me, maybe keep art as a hobby. They didn't say it cruelly, but the message always landed sharp. Malik was the future. I was the background. By the time I was 17, he had already founded a student finance club and won an economics award at state level. I won a regional art competition the same year. And I still remember walking into our kitchen, certificate in hand, cheeks flushed with pride. My dad was on the phone with Malik, congratulating him on getting early admission to Penn. My mom turned to me, smiled vaguely, and said, "Oh, that's cute, honey," then went back to making his favorite dinner. That was the pattern. He achieved. We celebrated. I created. They tolerated. I never hated him for it. But I hated how invisible I felt standing next to him. After high school, I got accepted into the Savannah College of Art and Design, one of the top art schools in the country. But my dad asked me if it was too risky. He said, "Malik's got a clear path. Art doesn't pay unless you're lucky." I nodded, packed my bags, and promised myself I'd find a way to prove them wrong, not through arguing, but by building something that would eventually speak louder than any defense I could give. I graduated in 2013 with a degree in visual communication and a minor in digital storytelling, ready to take on the world, portfolio in hand and eyes wide open. The world didn't care much. I bounced between freelance gigs, contract design work, and startup projects that barely covered my rent. I stayed in Atlanta, sharing apartments with friends who were also chasing creative careers, believing that one big break was just around the corner. Malik, meanwhile, rose through the ranks of private equity. By the time I was 28, he was managing millions, had moved into a glassy penthouse in Buckhead, and arrived at Thanksgiving in a Tesla with custom plates that read Winner Won. That year, my laptop broke, and I asked my parents if they could help me cover a replacement. My mom suggested I ask Malik. I didn't. By 30, I had co-founded a small creative studio called Nestcraft with two friends. We helped small businesses with brand identity and social content. It was exciting at first. We worked out of a co-working space and took meetings in coffee shops. We believed we were making something real, something that mattered. Until COVID hit, clients pulled out, budgets froze, and within 5 months, we were forced to shut down. One of my co-founders went back to corporate. The other moved to Portland to teach. I stayed. I drained my savings, trying to keep the website alive. Then eventually let it go. That winter, I moved back into my childhood bedroom in my parents' house. I was 31 years old, broke, exhausted, and humiliated. My dad tried to be supportive, but he looked worried every time I mentioned wanting to rebuild in tech. My mom avoided talking about work altogether, but she did ask me once if I had considered getting a certificate in UX to maybe help Malik's firm with digital stuff. Malik called that same week, inviting me to dinner. I knew what it was. Before I went, he wasn't checking in out of concern. He was curious, maybe a little amused. I showed up in my best thrifted blazer and flats that were beginning to peel. He greeted me with a glass of wine already poured. And the first thing he said was, "Jada, maybe it's time you stopped playing entrepreneur." I smiled. I always do. Because arguing with Malik is like trying to talk to a mirror that only reflects itself. He told me his fiancée's family was old money from Charleston, that her father managed a fund bigger than anything I could understand. Then he said it. "You'll never be rich like me. But that's okay. You've got heart." I laughed then, not because it was funny, but because I finally saw it clearly. He really believed money was the only scoreboard worth checking. I went home that night and opened my laptop. It barely worked, but I still had Sketch and Figma running. I clicked open a blank canvas and started outlining an idea that had been simmering in my mind since the last days of Nestcraft. Not out of revenge. Not to prove him wrong, but because I suddenly realized I had nothing left to lose. The sketch on my screen was rough, but the concept was clear. What if independent designers and small studios had a platform that actually worked the way creatives think, not the way engineers dictate? I remembered how frustrating it was at Nestcraft to juggle 5 tools just to get a logo approved. What I wanted didn't exist yet. Something clean, visual, intuitive. That balanced flexibility and structure. I started mapping it out every night. Even when I was crashing on my childhood twin bed, surrounded by old dance trophies and Malik's forgotten college textbooks. I named the file Pulse Frame because I believed good design has rhythm. It breathes with people, not against them. I didn't tell anyone for weeks, not even Leah, who was the only person I still kept in regular contact with from my design circle. She was working remotely from Austin, but we caught up once a month over Zoom. One night, I finally opened up and showed her the wireframes. She went quiet for a full minute, then leaned back and said, "Jada, this isn't a side project. This is a platform." She offered to help on nights and weekends, splitting her time between freelance work and what we now called the thing. We didn't have money, but we had clarity. Leah brought structure. I brought vision. We worked from Google Docs and Canva mockups, building user flows, and testing with friends in our old Slack groups. The first investor I pitched was a family friend, someone who used to clap politely at my school art shows and now managed a venture fund. He glanced through the deck, barely read the one-pager, and said, "Honestly, Jada, design is crowded. Canva already won." He added that maybe if Malik had built it, he'd take a second look. That comment stayed with me longer than it should have. Rejection. I expected. The dismissal. The idea that creativity had no weight unless it wore a suit. That was what stung. But I kept going. The second rejection was more polite, but hit harder. A woman investor I admired told me the product was promising, but I wasn't the right founder profile. When I asked what she meant, she smiled and said, "It's just hard to picture the scale." I knew what that meant. Wrong background. Wrong industry. Maybe even wrong gender. I went home that night and rewatched our pitch video. I took notes. I rewrote our story. Leah and I stripped the pitch down to the problem, the pain point, and the people we were building for. I applied to a local startup incubator in Atlanta. We didn't get in, but one of the coordinators remembered my application and invited me to a small roundtable for underrepresented founders. That's where I met Victoria Hale. She didn't talk much, just listened. After the session ended, she asked me to walk her through the product one-on-one. I pulled out my laptop and showed her the prototype. She nodded slowly as I explained how we wanted to make branding tools not only powerful, but human. She asked smart questions, then said, "Let me think." 2 weeks later, Victoria emailed me at 6:43 a.m. She offered $100, 0-inch pre-seed funding, and mentorship in exchange for equity. I cried when I read it, alone, in my car outside a public library parking lot where I had been using free Wi-Fi. That money felt like oxygen. We used every dollar strategically. Leah and I incorporated as Pulseframe Inc., bought a basic development license, and hired a freelance developer who used to work at a mid-tier SaaS company. We worked out of Leah's sunroom, then moved into a tiny co-working space with just enough room for 3 chairs and a whiteboard. For the first 6 months, we lived on caffeine and hope. We didn't launch. We listened. Every time we thought we had something great, we tested it and broke it. Then we rebuilt it better. Our first beta users were designers at small nonprofits and early-stage startups. They didn't need perfection. They needed speed, clarity, and collaboration that didn't make them feel like they were second class compared to developers. That's when I realized our platform wasn't just about design. It was about power. Who gets to move fast? Who gets to be heard? We weren't just giving tools. We were giving independence. Malik, Of course. Didn't know any of this. At family dinners, he still asked if I was still doing the artsy app thing. Once, he told my mother that I should consider learning some real business operations. He offered to help clean it up if I wanted to eventually get serious and sell it as a portfolio project. I didn't even reply. Not out of pride, but because I'd learned something more valuable than defending myself. Silence can be strategy. There's power in letting people underestimate you. That fall, Victoria introduced us to a small accelerator focused on women-led tech startups. We joined the cohort and finally launched the beta to a closed community. Within 4 weeks, we had over 600 signups. Not massive, but concentrated. The feedback was better than anything I had ever experienced. One user wrote, "This is the first time I've felt like the software actually gets how I work." That line stayed on the wall of our office long after we moved out. By the time Malik invited me to his engagement party, I already had a second meeting scheduled with a major SaaS investor. Victoria had hinted that an acquisition might be on the table within the year. We were far from finished, but we weren't small anymore. I wasn't ready to gloat, and I wasn't trying to prove anything to Malik. But I did start to wonder what it would feel like to finally walk into a room and be seen not as his little sister, but as the founder of something real. The invitation came on a Thursday morning, delivered by courier, in a thick, cream-colored envelope that smelled faintly of cologne and ambition. The front was embossed with Malik's initials in gold foil, and inside was a formal card that read, "Mr. Malik Pinkett and Miss.com. Candice Monroe requests the pleasure of your company at their engagement celebration." It was being held at the Lenox in downtown Atlanta, a rooftop venue, known more for investment conferences than family parties. At the bottom, in delicate cursive, was a note in Candice's handwriting. "Black tie. Optional. Family is everything." I stared at it for a moment, then slid it under a stack of notebooks on my desk. There was no RSVP deadline. There didn't need to be. In my family, silence usually meant agreement. Malik called that night. Casual but rehearsed. He started with small talk, then got to the point. "It would mean a lot to Mom if you came," he said. "Candace's family is very traditional. They appreciate presentation." His voice paused slightly, then added, "So if you do come, maybe leave the graphic designer energy at home." I smiled at the phone, like it could feel sarcasm. "I'm not planning to bring a tablet," I said evenly. He laughed and said, "Good. You know how Dad gets when things look messy." I said I'd think about it, and we hung up without ever really having a conversation. The next few days, I threw myself into work like the party didn't exist. We were closing a small bridge round led by a group of angel investors Victoria had introduced us to, and I was preparing for a feature on a niche tech podcast. Leah was deep into redesigning our onboarding experience, and we had finally hired a community manager named Brielle, who had spent 5 years building audience trust at a large branding agency. Things were moving, fast, quiet, and steady. I told Victoria about the engagement party during one of our check-in calls. She laughed and said, "You should go. Every founder deserves their dramatic reveal moment. It's practically a rite of passage." I didn't plan on making a scene. That wasn't my style. But I did start thinking about how I wanted to show up. Not to impress Malik or his fiancée's family, but to show myself that the girl who once felt small in every family room was no longer trying to be seen. She had become someone who created space for herself. I went shopping for a dress with the same focus I used when refining a pitch deck. Nothing too flashy, but something that said, "I know who I am." I chose a fitted black velvet gown with clean lines and deep pockets. Simple, tailored, intentional. The night before the party, I met with Victoria and her legal team to review acquisition interest from a mid-tier design software company that had been watching us quietly for months. It wasn't public yet, but the numbers were on the table. If everything moved forward, PulseFrame would be acquired within the quarter. The valuation exceeded anything I had allowed myself to imagine during those first months sketching wireframes on a cracked laptop. Victoria looked at me over her glasses and said, "Jada, you need to start thinking like someone who built a company, not someone who escaped failure." That stuck with me the next morning as I stood in my tiny kitchen pouring coffee into a mug from our very first pop-up event. I wasn't a survivor anymore. I was a builder. And I was about to walk into a room full of people who only ever saw me as the girl who didn't quite make it. I printed a single copy of the acquisition offer, folded it carefully into a small black envelope, and slid my business card inside. I didn't write a note. I wasn't sure I'd give it to Malik. But I wanted to carry something that reminded me I had choices. That evening, I arrived at the Lenox just before sunset. The rooftop had been transformed into a showcase of white florals, crystal chandeliers, and smooth jazz humming behind clinking glasses. Waiters moved through the crowd with trays of tiny appetizers I couldn't name. I walked in alone, head held steady, and gave my name at the door. The host raised an eyebrow, glanced at the list, and said, "Ah, the sister. Please, right this way." That phrase landed in my stomach like a weight. The sister, not Jada, not guest, not designer, not founder, just a relation to the man of the hour. My parents found me quickly. My mother adjusted my necklace and whispered, "You look appropriate," which, in her language, was a compliment. My father nodded and said, "You made it. Good. Malik has some important people here tonight. Let's keep it elegant." I smiled at them both, then walked toward the bar, where I ordered sparkling water, and watched the crowd as if I wasn't part of it. Malik stood near the center, laughing with a group of men in suits that probably cost more than my college tuition. When he saw me, he raised his glass in a half-wave. I raised mine back, politely, from a distance. The party was everything I expected. Guests moved through carefully curated spaces, pausing for photo ops under a branded backdrop with Malik and Candace's initials. Her father made rounds like a senator, shaking hands, and introducing Malik as the future of our family's financial expansion. My mother beamed every time someone complimented the match. My father watched the floor like he was guarding a political alliance. And me, I listened. I answered questions when asked. I smiled when appropriate. And I waited. Because sometimes, silence isn't absence. It's strategy. And sometimes, the most powerful move is letting the room underestimate you until the moment you decide to shift the entire story. Near the end of dinner, after the speeches from Candace's father and a carefully prepared montage of vacation clips and engagement photos, Malik rose from his chair, champagne flute in hand. He looked completely at ease, practiced, like someone used to holding court. His voice cut through the soft murmurs as he thanked everyone for coming, praised Candace for her elegance, and expressed admiration for both families coming together in shared vision. Then he paused, smiled in my direction, and said something that made the entire table glance toward me. "You know," he began, "life takes us all in different directions. Some build firms, some build dreams. And dreams are beautiful, even when they don't exactly pay the rent." There was polite laughter, the kind that comes when no one is sure whether a comment is playful or pointed. Malik raised his glass higher and finished, "To different paths, and to knowing the difference between a passion and a plan." I didn't flinch. I simply took a sip of my drink, stared straight ahead, and nodded like it meant nothing. That's when I knew. I had planned to stay quiet, to let the press release go out the following week with no drama. I didn't come here to prove anything, but standing in that room, surrounded by people who still thought of me as an unfinished version of Malik, I realized I had allowed that narrative to persist for far too long. Not for them, but for me. That story had cast a shadow over every small victory I'd earned, every quiet milestone, and it was time to end it. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the small black envelope. I walked across the room calmly, heels clicking softly on the marble tile, and stopped just in front of Malik, who still held his champagne midair. "For you," I said, voice steady, but low enough that the table leaned forward. "Just a little something to mark your engagement." He looked amused, maybe even a little touched, and opened it immediately, expecting some kind of card with an illustration or joke inside. Instead, he unfolded the single page and stared. The lines on his face shifted slowly from curious to confused, then slowly hardened into a silence I hadn't seen on him since we were kids, and I finally beat him at chess. "What is this?" he asked, trying to keep his voice level. Candace leaned in, reading over his shoulder, Her smile faded, replaced by something more calculating. It's real, I said, still calm. Pulse frame. We signed the acquisition deal yesterday morning. The valuation is in the second paragraph. If you're interested. A murmur passed through the table. One of Malik's colleagues leaned forward, reading the header on the paper upside down. Someone else pulled out their phone, probably already looking it up. I didn't stay to watch it spread. I turned toward the room and raised my glass. I wasn't going to share this tonight, I began. But since we're all reflecting on different paths, I thought it might be a good time to acknowledge that, sometimes, the most uncertain ones lead somewhere real. I didn't raise my voice. Didn't brag. Didn't list numbers. I didn't need to. Pulse frames started in a garage, with borrowed Wi-Fi and free coffee. Now, it's used by design teams in 28 countries. With the backing of a firm whose name I couldn't pronounce 5 years ago. I built it not because I wanted to be rich, but because I wanted creatives to have tools built for them, not around them. There was a pause, and then applause. Not thunderous, not staged, but genuine. I saw eyes shift across the room, recalibrating. I saw Malik's shoulders pull back, tight, jaw set like someone clenching a lesson they weren't ready to swallow. Candace's father stood up, walked over, and shook my hand. Impressive, he said, tone unreadable, but respectful. I'd like to hear more sometime. I said I'd be happy to. As I turned to leave the center of the room, I passed by my mother, whose eyes were glassy but proud. She mouthed, "Why didn't you tell us?" I smiled and simply said, "Because I needed to tell myself first." Later, when the music picked back up and the awkward air began to fade into dancing and small talk, Malik found me near the bar. He didn't yell. He didn't argue. He just said, "You could have let me have this night." I looked at him and replied, "You had it. I just reclaimed mine." He looked away for a second, then finally asked the question I had waited years to hear. "You really built that? On your own?" I nodded. "With people who believed in it long before anyone else did. You should try that sometime." That moment didn't fix everything, but it shifted the balance. And in families like mine, sometimes, that's all it takes to begin rewriting the story. After the party, things moved fast. The next morning, before I'd even finished my coffee, my inbox had 6 messages from people who had been at the engagement investors. Consultants. Even one of Candace's cousins asking if I'd be open to conversations about partnerships or advisory roles. Our press release went live at 9 a.m. sharp. By noon, we were trending on LinkedIn. That afternoon, I sat across from Victoria in a conference room with floor-to-ceiling glass, watching the Atlanta skyline, while she scrolled through press coverage. She said nothing at first, just turned her phone toward me and grinned. "This is going to open doors," she finally said. I nodded. But inside, I felt a different shift happening. Not about status or attention, but about identity. For the first time in my adult life, I didn't feel like I was surviving someone else's narrative. I had written my own, quietly, piece by piece. The week unfolded like a memory on fast forward. My parents called more times than they had in the past 6 months combined. My mom left a voicemail saying she had always known I was capable of something big. As if rewriting our family history would make her feel less guilty for having doubted me. My father's message was shorter, quieter. "I was wrong," he said. "About what matters. I'm proud of you, Jada." I played that one twice. On Wednesday, Malik showed up at my office without warning. He stood at the reception desk, shifting awkwardly as our office manager asked if he had an appointment. He didn't. When I came out to greet him, he looked around the lobby like he had walked into a foreign country. "This, yours?" he asked. Not unkindly. I nodded and invited him in. The space was simple, but elegant. Our brand colors on the walls framed user testimonials. Design awards stacked beside product roadmaps. He took it all in, then settled across from me, in the small meeting room we used for interviews and founder check-ins. We talked. Really talked. For the first time in years, he asked how we had scaled so fast. How I handled churn. How we recruited without burning out. I answered every question like I would with any investor. Honest but direct. Halfway through, he said, "You know, I thought you'd built something cute. I didn't realize it was real. I didn't say thank you. Instead, I leaned back and said, that's the difference. You waited for validation. I built without it. He nodded slowly, then laughed. Yeah, that's on me. It didn't fix everything. Family doesn't change overnight. But there was something in his eyes I hadn't seen before. Respect. Maybe. Or recognition. Like he finally saw me, not as his younger sister tagging along, but as someone who had walked a different road and built her own destination. That's what I carried with me into the following month, as we began transition talks with the acquiring firm. I stayed on as Chief Strategy Officer, and Leah became Head of Product. We negotiated our values into every line of the deal. From user data protections to funding for a mentorship platform, we were quietly developing for underrepresented creatives. The most unexpected part came when Candace's father reached out. He asked if I'd be open to advising his firm's internal branding refresh. At first I thought it was performative, some attempt to save face after the party. But when we met, he came prepared. He'd researched PulseFrame. He asked sharp questions. He understood the platform better than I expected. Before we ended the meeting, he said something that caught me off guard. Candace told me you built this while the whole world assumed you were failing. That's the kind of founder I respect. I shook his hand. Not because I needed the validation, but because I knew what it cost him to say it. By the end of that quarter, we had launched a new creator fund inside PulseFrame to support freelancers during economic downturns. We didn't make a big show of it. We just did it, quietly, consistently, like everything else. And as the press coverage faded, and the spotlight moved on to the next trending founder, I found something I hadn't expected: peace. Not because I had proven Malik wrong, but because I no longer needed him to be wrong in order for me to be right. Some nights, I'd drive past the Lenox, look up at the rooftop, where it all shifted, and wonder how many other people stood in rooms built to make them feel small, waiting for the moment they finally chose to own their voice. Not to shout, just to speak. About 3 months after the acquisition closed, I was invited to speak at a conference in Seattle focused on women-led innovation. It wasn't a flashy event. Not the kind that makes headlines. But it mattered to me. The audience wasn't made up of venture capitalists or polished startup celebrities. It was mostly educators, nonprofit leaders, small founders, people who were building things in quiet corners of the world without a spotlight. When I took the stage, I didn't talk about funding rounds or press coverage. I talked about starting from a garage and being told to get a real job. I talked about building tools not just to scale business, but to restore creative dignity. And I talked about my brother, without naming him. About the difference between chasing validation and choosing purpose. After the panel, a woman about my mother's age approached me in the hallway. She introduced herself as a retired public school art teacher from Ohio and said she had shown PulseFrame to her granddaughter who was struggling with self-worth after dropping out of a coding boot camp. She said it made her feel seen again. The woman told me. I thanked her, stepped away, and cried in the elevator. Not because of the compliment, but because it reminded me of Miss Grace, the only teacher who ever told me at 16 that creativity wasn't decoration. It was currency. That elevator ride was the first time in years I let myself feel how far I'd come from that quiet, overlooked girl at the dining table, whose drawings were ignored for another financial trophy on the wall. That fall, I returned to my high school for the first time in over a decade. The art department was underfunded, and half the computers didn't work. But the passion in the students' sketches on the wall hadn't dimmed. I sat with a group of seniors and showed them how PulseFrame worked. Not as a demo, but as a conversation. One of them asked if I had ever thought about quitting. I told her the truth. Not just once. Many times. But every time I did, something small pulled me back: a comment from a user, a sketch that made sense of my emotions, or just the memory of being underestimated and quietly refusing to let that be the ending. I left that day with a commitment to do more than just succeed. I wanted to create infrastructure for others like me, who weren't built for traditional paths, but still carried something worth sharing. With Victoria's support, we created a fellowship inside PulseFrame, offering paid mentorship, technical tools, and business coaching for young creatives from public school backgrounds. We didn't frame it as charity. It wasn't a program to save anyone. It was an investment in potential that often goes unseen because the people holding the purse strings are too busy measuring ROI by pedigree. Around the same time, Malik reached out again. This time, it wasn't to check in on PulseFrame or to ask business questions. It was because he and Candace were expecting a baby. He said it calmly, like someone who was still adjusting to what that news meant. I've been thinking a lot about legacy, he said. What we pass on, intentionally or not. I listened quietly, then asked, "What do you want your kid to believe about success?" He hesitated, then said, "That it's not just about money. It's about impact. About building something that reflects who you are, not just what you can earn." That wasn't a full transformation, but it was a start. And sometimes, that's all you can hope for in family, a crack in the old framework, wide enough to let some light through. We met for lunch a week later. Just the two of us. No parents. No spouses. He asked if I'd ever thought about writing a book. I said not yet. Maybe someday. If I ever figured out how to explain that success isn't one thing you reach, it's what you choose. Again and again. In silence and in setbacks. In small rooms and on big stages. Whether people are watching or not. He smiled and said, "You're still poetic, Jay." I smiled back and replied, "You're still polished." That was our way of saying we were okay. By the time PulseFrame passed its one-year milestone post-acquisition, we had expanded into 3 new countries and launched a partnership with a major online design school. But more importantly, we had funded over 200 young creatives through our fellowship. I kept a file on my desk with their photos and names, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of why this mattered. Because for every person like me who finally found her voice, there were hundreds still whispering in rooms where no one was listening. It wasn't until the next Thanksgiving that I understood just how much had changed. We gathered at my parents' house, just like every year, with the same casserole recipes and the same mismatched wine glasses. But the energy was different. My father asked if I could help him move the table closer to the window. And when I did, I noticed a new framed photo sitting on the shelf beside Malik's college graduation portrait. It was me, standing on stage at the Seattle conference, holding the PulseFrame logo beside a slide that read, "Design is a language. Build tools that listen." My mother saw me looking at it and said, almost casually, "Your father had that printed." Said it felt overdue. I didn't say anything. I just smiled and helped set the table. Malik arrived later than usual, balancing a car seat with one arm and a diaper bag with the other. Candace followed behind, is looking tired, but peaceful. Their daughter, Mila, was barely 3 months old, all cheeks and soft grunts. I hadn't held a baby in years, and when Malik offered her to me during dessert, I froze for a second before reaching out. She settled into my arms. Like we'd done this before in another lifetime. "She's gonna be stubborn like you," he said, not as a jab, but with the slow realization of someone seeing traits he used to reject now show up in the thing he loves most. Later that night, after everyone else had gone to bed, Malik and I stood on the back porch, nursing what was left of a bottle of wine, and listening to the wind rustle the trees. He told me he was thinking of taking a step back from the firm, maybe consulting part-time, so he could be more present. I didn't offer advice. I just listened, the way no one had ever really listened to me when I was figuring things out. Eventually, he asked if I remembered the time he told me I'd never be rich like him. I laughed softly and said, which time he shook his head. "I meant it as a weapon back then," he admitted. "I thought money was proof, and I needed proof that I mattered." I looked at him, not with judgment, but with the kind of understanding that only comes after years of distance. "We both did," I said, "just in different ways." That was the closest we ever came to an apology. And honestly, it was enough. Because growth isn't always about grand gestures. Sometimes it's just 2 people, sitting side by side, finally sharing the same silence without resentment between them. That winter, I flew to New York to be part of a panel at an international design summit. The moderator introduced me as the founder of one of the most quietly disruptive platforms in the creative tech space. And I smiled, not because it sounded impressive, but because it was true. We had built something quietly, persistently, without flash or shortcuts. And that silence had been our strength. After the panel, a young man approached me, probably in his early 20s, and told me he had been following PulseFrame since our beta launch. He said he'd almost quit design school twice, but kept going after seeing our early founder updates on social. "You looked like someone who had been overlooked," he said. And I thought, if she can do it, maybe I can too. I thanked him, shook his hand, and walked away slowly, letting the weight of those words settle where they belonged. Not in my ego, but in my memory, as a reminder that the real impact of your work is rarely measured in press coverage or bank accounts. It's measured in the way your presence allows someone else to believe in themselves again. In the spring, PulseFrame celebrated its 500,000th user. Leah threw a small party in the office. Just us, and a few team members. No cameras. No a live stream. We ate cake off paper plates, and watched the number tick past the milestone in real time. I stood near the whiteboard where we used to sketch ideas that felt impossible. And I felt something shift inside me. Not pride exactly, but alignment. Like all the noise in my head had finally been replaced with quiet certainty. I wasn't chasing anything anymore. I was building. And that felt more powerful than any public recognition I'd ever received. A week later, I received an invitation in the mail. It was from an arts foundation Candace's mother chaired, asking if I would consider joining their advisory board. In the same envelope was a handwritten note. "Thank you for showing our family a different definition of legacy." I stared at it for a long moment, then tucked it into my desk drawer, beside a sketch I'd made in college. One I used to be ashamed of because I thought it looked too childish. Now, I see it for what it is. A beginning. Unpolished. Brave. Honest. As I closed the drawer, I thought about all the people who were still waiting to be taken seriously, still showing up to family dinners with handmade gifts, while others arrived in new suits and expensive watches. I wanted them to know that quiet success is still success, that being overlooked is not the same as being unworthy, and that sometimes the best revenge is not revenge at all, it's simply becoming someone you're proud to be. By the end of that year, PulseFrame had doubled its team, launched a browser-native version for educators, and opened its first international office in Amsterdam. Those were all measurable wins. But the moment that stuck with me didn't come from a dashboard or a press article. It came one Sunday afternoon at my parents' house. When my mother handed me a stack of sketchbooks I'd left behind years ago. "I thought you might want these now," she said softly. I opened one and saw a page filled with color blocks, notes in the margins, messy thumbnails from the days before I even knew what UI design was. I flipped through slowly, watching my younger self try to figure things out without a roadmap. My father, who had just returned from walking Malik's dog, sat beside me and looked over my shoulder. He pointed at a charcoal drawing of an old tree I'd sketched in high school and said, "I didn't get this back then, but now I see it. You were always building something." That night, I drove home in silence. Not from awkwardness, but from a kind of emotional fullness I couldn't name. The kind that only comes after years of waiting to be understood. And realizing that even if it came late, it still mattered. That kind of recognition doesn't erase the years you spent in the dark, but it shines just enough light to remind you it wasn't wasted. In the months that followed, I spent less time checking metrics and more time mentoring. I started blocking out every Friday for one-on-one calls with young creatives applying to our fellowship. Some were students, others career changers. A few were stay-at-home, parents picking up design at night while their kids slept. They asked all the questions I used to be afraid to ask out loud. What if I don't look like the other founders? What if I have no money? No connections? What if I'm building something that no one understands? Yet I didn't give them perfect answers. I just told them the truth. That clarity doesn't come all at once. That momentum often looks like stillness. That you don't need to have everyone believe in you, just one person. And sometimes, that person has to be you first. The more I shared my story, the more I realized how common it was. The specifics changed different cities, different industries, different families. But the theme stayed the same. Someone was told their path was impractical. Someone was asked when they'd get a real job. Someone was made to feel small in the name of tradition or ambition, or someone else's comfort. And yet they kept going. Not to prove anyone wrong, but to finally feel right in their own skin. One evening, Leah and I sat on the roof of our new building, watching the city shift from day to night. She told me that one of our earliest users had just landed a creative director role at a nonprofit because of a campaign she designed entirely through PulseFrame. She said it made her feel powerful. Leah said, pulling up the email, said she never thought her name would be on anything real. I closed my eyes and let that sink in. Because in the end, that was the metric that mattered most. Not ARR or headcount or acquisition offers, but that someone who once doubted their voice now had proof of its reach. Around that time, Malik and I started something unexpected. We launched a podcast. Just the two of us. Once a month. Talking about building, failing, parenting, legacy, and all the places where ambition and identity collide. We didn't make it about our past. We didn't air old wounds. We talked like siblings who had grown up under the same roof but carried very different storms inside them. And somewhere between episode 3 and 4, I realized I no longer needed to be on guard around him. The tension that used to sit between us had softened into something more honest. He had grown. So had I. During one episode, I told a story about a rejection email I'd kept in my inbox for 5 years. I didn't name names. But I said this: sometimes people can't see your vision, not because it's broken, but because they've never had to imagine something that didn't already exist. That doesn't mean you stop. It just means you learn to walk through the fog. The message inbox exploded after that one. Not because I sounded wise, but because it struck a nerve that didn't need drama to feel true. That's the thing I've learned about quiet power. It doesn't need applause. It just needs space. 6 months after our podcast launched, I was invited to keynote a private retreat for first-time women founders. The event wasn't public. There were no media crews or press tables. Just 30 women seated in a circle at a converted ranch house in New Mexico. Some had just gotten their first round of funding. Others were still juggling day jobs and prototypes. They asked raw, unfiltered questions, not about valuations or exit strategy, but about self-doubt, shame, burnout, guilt. One woman asked how I handled building when no one believed in me. I paused, then told her something I hadn't admitted out loud until that moment. I stopped needing belief from others, but I didn't stop needing reminders. So, I left myself notes everywhere. On my mirror, in my sketchbook, inside folders no one else would open. Not to prove I was capable, but to remember. I was building something even when it didn't look like it yet. That moment reminded me of a version of myself. I rarely looked back on the woman sitting in a shared apartment, avoiding family events, folding rejection emails into her coat pocket just to carry the sting somewhere private. I didn't miss her, but I honored her. Because without that quiet persistence, nothing else would have followed. That night, I couldn't sleep. So I walked the grounds under a soft desert sky and thought about how many people still move through their lives unseen. Their contributions reduced to side projects. Their ambition called naive, just because it isn't dressed like power. And I realized I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even waiting for more recognition. I just wanted to keep making space for people like that to be visible. Back in Atlanta, our team held an offsite to plan PulseFrame's next phase. We were launching a curriculum platform, designed specifically for high school art programs, with accessible templates and audio-visual guides that worked on older computers. Leah proposed we call it Draft Space, a nod to the messy, uncelebrated beginnings of every creator's journey. I loved the name. It captured what I'd spent the last 10 years learning, that progress isn't always polished. Sometimes it's scratched into lined paper with a borrowed pencil, scribbled during a lunch break, or drawn in silence while the rest of the house is asleep. A few weeks later, I was invited back to my high school to speak at their career day. I stood in front of a classroom that hadn't changed much. The same green tile, the same flickering overhead lights. Miss Grace was gone. She'd retired the year before, but the new art teacher, a former student of hers, welcomed me like family. I brought 10 free licenses for PulseFrame EDU and 3 refurbished tablets we'd quietly purchased with part of our community fund. At the end of my talk, A student raised her hand and asked if being a founder ever got easy. I smiled and said, "No, but it gets clearer. You stop needing to be loud to feel seen. You start recognizing your own work, even when no one claps." That afternoon, I sat in my car outside the school and cried, not from sadness or exhaustion, but from release, because for so long, I had thought closure would come from recognition, some final round of applause, some moment where everyone who had overlooked me finally said, "We were wrong." But real closure, I learned, comes from seeing yourself clearly, without needing the mirror of other people's approval, and from using that clarity not as a shield, but as a torch for someone else. A few nights later, Malik called. Mila had drawn her first recognizable image, a house with a tree and a woman standing beside it with a big red smile. She said, "That's you." He told me. She said Auntie Jada makes people with her computer. I laughed and asked if she was already showing signs of rebellion. He said, "If she ends up half as relentless as you, I'll consider it a win." For the first time, I didn't feel like we were comparing paths. We were walking side by side, each carrying different lessons, finally sharing the same language of quiet pride. When I hung up, I opened my old archive folder, the one where I kept the earliest sketches of PulseFrame, the bootstrapped logo, the first failed wireframe. I scrolled through slowly, remembering how much of it had started with a single question. What if the world saw creative people as architects of value, not just decorators of other people's ideas? And now, here we were, proof that it was possible to build something big without having to make yourself small first. 2 years after PulseFrame went global, we hosted our first founder showcase in Atlanta. We didn't book a hotel, ballroom, or tech hub. Instead, we rented the same converted warehouse that once served as our first design lab. The walls still carried faded chalk marks from early brainstorming sessions. The air smelled like pine wood and fresh paint. The team had restored it just for the event. We invited every fellow from our early programs, every mentor who had ever given us time, and even the barista from the cafe where Leah and I had once sketched product ideas on napkins. The night wasn't about hype. It was about wholeness. People walked in with their families, their pitch decks, their stories. We didn't spotlight billionaire. We spotlighted builders. As the final speaker stepped down, Malik took the mic to close the evening. It wasn't planned, but the crowd leaned in. He talked about our childhood, about the assumptions he had made, about how the story he'd told himself was too small to contain what I had become. His voice didn't crack. It steadied. Then he turned toward me and said, "I used to think money made you rich. But watching my sister build a world from scratch made me understand that wealth isn't about what you keep. It's about what you create." The room went still. I didn't smile. I just let the words settle where they belonged. After the showcase, I walked alone into the parking lot. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt anchored. Because every twist in the story, every dismissal, every betrayal, every moment I thought I wouldn't recover, had folded into this quiet truth. I didn't need to win in public to feel complete. I just needed to know I had done the work, that I had built something that couldn't be erased or rewritten, and that maybe, somewhere, out there, someone was watching my journey and choosing to try again. A few days later, I received a message from a former classmate I hadn't spoken to in 15 years. She'd followed the story online. She wrote, "I remember when they laughed at your portfolio. I wish I had said something back then. But I see you now." I didn't reply. I didn't need to. Sometimes closure doesn't come through conversation. It comes through clarity. And that message, unexpected and late as it was, reminded me that stories never really end. They ripple. On a quiet Sunday, Leah and I sat in our studio reviewing applications for the next cohort. One name caught my eye, a teenage girl from Richmond. Her portfolio wasn't polished, but her vision was raw and fierce. In her essay, she wrote, "My family told me to pick something safer, but I want to build tools that show people like me that we belong in the room." I looked at Leah and said, "She's in." Not because she was ready, but because I remembered what it felt like to need just one person to say yes. Later that night, I opened my email and saw a photo Malik had sent. Mila was standing next to a science fair project about visual perception and interface design. Her title read, My aunt builds brains. Not just brands. I laughed quietly. Maybe I had never said it that way. But maybe that's what I had been doing all along, trying to help people see themselves more clearly in a world that often blurred them out. And so here we are. Not in the spotlight. Not in the tabloids. But in the work. In the small, consistent labor of turning doubt into design. Exclusion into opportunity. Silence into signal. If I've learned anything, it's that revenge is noisy, but reinvention is quiet. It doesn't make headlines. It makes history. So the next time someone tells you that you'll never be rich,